As most of you know, a little over a week ago, I had the privilege of accompanying youth from our parish who are part of our Journey to Adulthood program on a 28-mile pilgrimage through the neighborhoods of Omaha, Bellevue, and Papillion. Historically, pilgrimages were typically made to shrines, holy places, or locations of religious significance. While we had no shrines to walk to in the area, there were a few Episcopal churches along our path. So I guess you could say we stopped at a few holy places. Traveling from church to church, we went through the various neighborhoods of the city, picking up trash along the way. We picked up quite a bit of trash, but that wasn't the real purpose of our journey. The purpose of our pilgrimage was to see the different neighborhoods and the people who lived in them in a different way. You see, we learn about our surrounding neighborhoods largely by what we read in the paper, what we hear on the news, or what we see in that fleeting moment, that glimpse, as we drive by them. Problem is, none of these methods offer us insight into what life in those neighborhoods is really like. Near the end of my Air Force career, I was stationed in England. And because the kids were still in school, I went over about 5 months ahead of my family. And the base I was initially stationed at was an RAF base about an hour north of the big American complexes at RAF Mildenhall and Lakenheath. And once a week I would enjoy driving down through the villages and towns on my way to Mildenhall to pick up my mail. However, as I did, it just didn't feel like I was really getting to know England. Something didn't feel quite right. It was quite pretty, but I didn't think I was really seeing life as it was. Because when I drove through these villages, animals kind of scurried in all different directions. People would stop doing whatever it is they were doing to look up at this strange car driving through their town. After a month or so, I bought a bicycle, and I began riding through some of those same villages. And I could not help but notice the difference. I no longer disrupted life. I simply became part of it. I almost blended in. And this enabled me to see things more naturally, more like they were. It's the same when I go scuba diving. If I'm swimming big, breathing hard, blowing lots of bubbles, I don't see what I would see when I swim small and slow, taking deep, gentle breaths. When we were on vacation last month, one of the neatest things that I experienced was on a dive I was on. And it was one of these dives where I and the whole group that I was with just naturally were swimming small and slow. And all of a sudden, out of the middle of nowhere, we were engulfed in this huge school of fish. And instinctively, we all did the same thing. We stopped moving. We drifted with the current. And for a moment, we were part of the life around us. It was like that on my bike rides through the villages in England. And that was the type of experience we wanted our youth to have as they walked through the neighborhoods. For the most part, I think we were successful. As we walked, we saw the neighborhoods, not as they're portrayed on the news, but more like they really are. Friendlier, cleaner than most expected, and communities that were much more like our own than we had imagined. We heard the sounds of kids playing and laughing. People in conversation as they passed us on the sidewalk. Sound of lawnmowers cutting grass, just as they were trying to make home feel like home. Now, I'm not trying to say bad things don't happen in some of these neighborhoods. Bad things happen everywhere, don't they? But one thing that we all saw was that there is more good than bad in the world. And that was something refreshing for our youth to witness. Did our perceptions of these neighborhoods change on this journey? Only one time through, I doubt they changed dramatically. But at least it opened a window to see God's grace in others. And we showed others the grace of God that is in us. It's a start. And like any journey, it begins by placing one foot in front of the other and stepping out in faith. I think that's part of what Paul is trying to tell the Galatians. Paul wrote this letter about 17 years after his conversion on that road to Damascus, to some of the very first Gentile converts to Christianity. Not to entice their conversion, but to encourage them as they try to live out this newfound faith. Over the next 4 or 5 Sundays, we're going to read from Paul's letter to the Galatians. So let me help frame why this encouragement was so necessary. As Paul journeyed throughout this region, spreading the good news that Jesus is Lord, and that through him salvation had been offered to all, there were a few people following behind him, called Judaizers, that twisted his message by adding requirements, things that had to be done that were mandated by Jewish law to know the grace of God. This tension between the old way and the new, between two different messengers, slightly different messages, is part of what prompted the Council of Jerusalem that we read about in Acts 15. And what came out of that council was an understanding that while the law itself was good and just, by itself, it does not justify. Only faith could open that window that would allow God's grace to enter our lives, thereby offering us the awareness of God's mercy. So he begins his letter by warning the people of Galatia that they have strayed from the message that he first shared with them. A message that was divine in origin. A message from one called by God to deliver it. His purpose was to gently guide them back to the right path. A path that was less about judging and more about loving. In other words, when we look at someone, do we judge them based on their outward appearances, or do we love them for who they really are? One of God's own. Throughout his letter, Paul will give us ways to see that there is more good in the world than bad. And that when we look, we can find God in others, even those whom we think it is impossible. And I'm hoping that is part of the message our youth got last week as they journeyed on their pilgrimage. There's something else Paul will encourage the people of Galatia to do. Something that's equally important to us today. And that is to ask the question, when people look at us, do they see the good in us? Do they see God? I'd like to say the answer to that question is, yes, Lord, always. But we're human. The more correct answer is, well, yes, Lord, most of the time, but we're working on it. Good news is that God reminds us repeatedly, as Paul reminds the Galatians, working on it is a good thing. We'll never get it completely right. We'll never be perfect in and through our own efforts. But with God's help, we can put one foot in front of the other as we journey through this life, opening windows along the way. Windows that allow others to see a glimpse of the grace of God our faith enables us to know. Grace that heals, grace that reveals, and grace that enables us to see God in and through one another.